My name is Siraj Seth, and I think I've met many of you. I'm from the University of East London. I'm also the director of the Center for Islamic Finance, Law and Communities. And I'm not going to give a talk. I'm a moderator, but I'm going to take the liberty of just setting the framework and the context for some of the exciting presentations we're going to have. This is a roundtable, and I hope that it'll be interactive. And this roundtable is called Human Rights-Based Approaches to Achieving the SDGs in terms of women's and youth rights. Now, this doesn't mean that people who are here are all human rights advocates. Many of us don't call ourselves that, but we are working towards the issues relating to empowerment, relating to rights, relating to agency, equality, and so on and so forth. So what do we mean by human rights? So many of us are actually aware of the fact that we have international human rights treaties. And these not only give rights to people, but also create obligations. Now, human rights treaties are different from human rights-based approaches, because we are not merely talking about the existence of human rights, but rather we are talking about how we can use human rights in programming, in the activities that you do. So the United Nations, as you may be aware, has developed a common understanding of human rights-based approaches. The goal happens to be that all programs, from the UN, which of course includes working with civil societies and all of us, in terms of development, cooperation, policies and technical assistance should further the realization of human rights as laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments. So if you think of the objective or the goal of all our work is to empower people, is to fulfill the development goals, but one of the ways of looking at it happens to be human rights itself. And then the process is important. We'll come to that in a moment. So when we carry out any activity, any program, we need to ensure that human rights standards and principles guide all development, cooperation and programming in all sectors and in all phases of the programming process. And finally, as far as an outcome is concerned, this should contribute to the development of the capacities of duty bearers to meet the obligations of rights holders to claim the rights. And this is where we begin now our discussion we'll be having in a short while, that in a very simplistic world, human rights is divided into those who have obligations and those who have rights. And you can't have one without the other. So the human rights-based approach essentially is recognizing who are the rights holders and who has a corresponding obligations, and so on. So therefore, it has a normative value, by which I mean the principles involved, but it also has an instrumental value in how we achieve things. And finally, and this is very important, it has an institutional value, by which we mean that you cannot have human rights and sustainability unless you're embedded within institutions, not just the UN, but in all the institutions that we are part of. So you therefore think of human rights for all, based on the principle of access, equality, non-discrimination, where there are duty bearers who have obligations, who are enabled. So really, if you talk about a state that has to fulfill its obligation, they have to respect, protect, and fulfill all human rights. But you need to have the capacity of even the state as well as accountability. But the rights holders are enabled equally, not only through awareness, but through assertion of rights to hold the duty bearer to account. So participation, accountability, transparency, governance is a very important element of actually getting to do fulfill sustainable development goals. So what am I referring to? I'm referring to the sustainable development goals as being recognized, as being very strongly entrenched in human rights-based approaches. Almost every one of the 17 SDGs arise or relate to clear, normative, and practical human rights. And that's one of the approaches. And if you recall, our speakers today are going to talk about empowering, or rather enabling or removing obstacles in terms of women, youth, or other underrepresented groups in achieving this. Now, let's not get into the dozens of international human rights treaties that are there. Many of the lawyers can talk to you about those instruments. But generally, it's accepted that human rights-based approaches, which, by the way, is adopted by virtually every single organization within the UN and many outside and government, What does that actually mean? It talks about the nature of human rights, which are universal and inalienable, cannot be given up. They're indivisible, so you can't choose one right over the other because they're interrelated, they're interdependent. And the idea of equality and non-discrimination is pretty much what you have talked about, which is that we leave nobody behind. We ensure that every single member of society is able to have access to and is able to achieve through the opportunities, through the outcomes that are there. So non-discrimination is very important, but we know that that is institutionalized, endemic in our institution. How do we resolve that? Through participation and inclusion. And the human rights-based approach is in fact a monitoring system. It ensures that we involve the various stakeholders at every single stage, not only in just identifying who they are, but what are the roles and how we can measure the progress that we're making. Finally, this is all about accountability, and that can be expressed in so many different ways. But what we mean by rule of law as part of human rights itself is that these are formal accounting systems which hold the state responsible, but also provide the fora where individuals can speak. So just briefly, if you had to adopt a human rights-based approaches, then what we look in the country analysis, in the mapping, becomes very, very important. Are we taking into consideration all the relevant people? Do we recognize the context and the responses that are required? Which leads us on to our strategic planning. The strategic planning must have a clear indicators which refer to the rights that we have talked about. And then we move on to the planning and the implementation phase, and then moving on to monitoring and evaluation. So what I hope that we'll be able to talk about today is a little bit about the various opportunities that we have. Our colleagues over here are going to take very different approaches from different parts of the world, but ultimately it'll come on to how do we measure success, how do we look at best practices, how do we scale, replicate them, and finally, how are we able to monitor and evaluate and find out what are the lessons learned and how we can move forward. And there are many different ways of doing that. A human rights-based approach is certainly one of them. So we at the Center for Islamic Finance, Law and Communities, which is about inclusion, governance, it is about poverty alleviation, have actually worked with a variety of partners across the world. So just recently at the UN Habitat Assembly, we along with many other organizations led human rights-based approach training for a large number of people. We've done that at the World Bank, we've done that at the Arab Land Conference, at the World Urban Forum. In all these cases, University of East London has developed materials which we are happy to share with you. We worked in Saudi Arabia, in Indonesia and Liberia, specifically in helping both government officials but also other non-state actors. We've carried out training of the UN officials themselves, and also along with specific customary and traditional tools. So for example, Islamic land law, where we have published quite widely, or on youth, or the criteria on gender responsiveness. So just to wrap up, to say that in whatever sphere or area that we work in, it's important for us to think about how our actions actually lead to these outcomes. The outcomes being, how do we empower those, or rather help people empower themselves to achieve what is there in the SDGs? That we actually convert what are pious goals into practical actions which can be measured and delivered. So I'm very pleased, therefore, to move on to our roundtable. The roundtable starts now, has started now, and we finish at 4 o'clock. We have 5 incredible speakers, and I think I will also request them, before they start off, to just introduce themselves a little bit. You already have their profiles, but I'd like you to remember the context in which they speak. I think our first speaker is Olivia Joseph Aluko, and I think it's appropriate that we start with the future and the youth and the role of technology in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. Remember that our conference is about sustainability, but it's also about research, science, and how we can contribute to the progress that mankind should make for everybody. Okay, Olivia, please welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start this session by saying thank you to Professor Hallam and the team for organizing this conference once again. It takes a lot of efforts to put this kind of epic conference together. As you can see, my topic today, can you hear me, please? Okay, great. Yeah, my topic today, it's on youths and technology. I'll just briefly give an overview of what global technology is about. Using the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 agenda says, leave no one behind. It's a clarion call. You know, when it was put together, no one should be left behind, which includes babies, it includes children, it includes youths, it includes women, it includes men, and maybe I would say animals. You will say, yes, sure, the climate, everything in the universe should not be left behind. Now, technology has evolved tremendously over the last 200 years. And by the 20th century, different ideas were made, which translated into technology. There are 7 types of technology. We've got agriculture, we've got biotechnology, we've got constructive technology, we've got medical technology, manufacturing technology, energy power technology, transportation technology. Now, in the 21st century, digital technology has become one of the things that's very common, that we commonly use, which includes access to the internet. It also includes platforms like the Facebook, it includes our websites, it includes different kinds of technology like LinkedIn. In the past 2 decades, digital technology has become a driving force in Africa, just as it is in every part of the world. African children are now growing up in a world where mobile technology, apps, social media, and other types of online communication influence them in much the same way that people relate to one another. There are about 650 million mobile phone owners in Africa, and the use of data, including 3G mobile phones, is also growing rapidly. The challenge is this. Only 11% of the world's internet subscribers are Africans. And only 32.5% of Africans use the internet. Out of all this, we've got about 400 million young people between the ages of 15 and 35 years, which accounts for 70% of the population of Africa. Next slide. Well, that defines what a youth is. It says youths it's a period of transition from dependence of childhood to the independence of adulthood and an awareness of interdependence as members of a community. I would skip that. Now, young Africans are embracing technology in droves, especially as an art of communication, while there are a few others who are using technology, digital technology, as an investment. Digital technology is an umbrella term for computer-based products. I've already defined that. I'm moving quickly because I know I don't have a lot of time. Now, we've said different things in this conference about the advantages of going online. For example, yesterday, there was a discussion about accessing the internet for online university. You know, there was various different platforms, you know, discussed about what can be done with internet. But I tell you that majority of African youths are left behind, and I'll give you why this is so. Now, unemployment is one of the major problems that's leaving the African youths behind. According to a report provided by the World Bank, about 60% of African youths are jobless. 25% of youths in North Africa are unemployed. And many youths in Africa suffer from poverty and ignorance. During a presentation in 2016, the CEO of Coca-Cola at the time, Kevin Balogun, he said, Africa, even though there are a lot of universities in Africa, but he said about 668 universities in Africa, but he said 10 million graduates are churned out, but half of them do not get employed. Now, if half of them don't get employed, how can they take part in nation building? How can they take part in development? So another challenge that they face is identity crisis. Because they are unemployed, because most of them are unemployed, they face identity crisis, loss of self-esteem, frustration leading to fraudulent behaviors, vandalism, insurgency, hooliganism. They also experience irritations leading to substance misuse, leading to depression, a whole lot of mental health problems. And also, you find out that some of these youths, so while some have other connections in which they can, get funding, to apply as an economic migrant to travel to some of the Western nations, not all of them are so lucky. So you find out that they go through the back roads, get themselves involved in different things, go through the Mediterranean Sea, pay money to human traffickers and, different things so that they could escape the challenges that are there. Now, it's not all gloom. Let's look at the digital future and African youths. African youths are contributing to digital technology in Africa through their homegrown innovative ideas. I'll give an example. In Nigeria, for example, there are hundreds of hubs in many cities. And many young people have churned out different mobile apps, which include traffic-based apps, edu apps, and MF apps in different parts of Africa, also including Kenya. But despite this, the problem of electricity. We'll come back to that. There are also some of the things that African youths have done, which includes mobile bank money transfers, that helps in such a way that people don't have to go to the banks, they can get a credit alert, using their phones, other people are developing ways. There's a company in Nigeria called Pega, who developed that, and there's another company called Kia for loans, using artificial intelligence, to develop financial solutions and loans for people. In Kenya, for example, you've got Med Africa, and what did Med Africa, what do they do? One of the things they do is they use that app to help patients to diagnose their symptoms and access directories of doctors and hospitals that can assist them. Now, barriers to slow growth in digital technology advancement in Africa. Power supply. A life without electricity cannot be imagined in the developed world. If we're all here and there's no electricity, we can't accomplish, we can't do nothing. But sadly in Africa, this is a daily reality. In Africa, just 2 in 5 people have access to reliable supply of energy throughout the day. Stores, you have about 625 million people who are without power in Africa. Another hindrance to the slow growth of digital technology is language. Language in Africa is not universal. We've got Francophone countries, we've got the Arabian countries, we've got the English countries. When these innovations, when they are released, into nations, they don't come, most of them, because they are from the Western world, they come in English. And the challenge is that, to decode what they are trying to say, it may take a whole load of expenses, and we're not sure the expenses that each government, would put into that to make sure it's translated into a language that grassroots people can, develop. We go to the absence of youth advocacy in sub-Saharan Africa. African youths in the sub-Saharan region are growing amidst challenges such as lack of employment, just like I said, and completion of education. A critical part of youth advocacy is vested in understanding the needs of youth in relation to the prevailing economic conditions. Youth advocacy bridges the gap between the youth, communities, and other government stakeholders. A well-structured youth organization group can help strengthen the voices and participation of young people in digital technology and sustainable development. The role of youth advocates in Africa is to educate the youth on available opportunities in the area of technology And the youth advocates also have a responsibility to monitor residents in a region so as to provide crisis intervention as the need arises. Now, despite the growth in technology, despite the advancement in technology, African youths, and it's not just only African youths, young people generally, they misuse technology rather than use it for investments. An average young person, according to statistics, spends 8 hours a day in front of social media, especially teenagers in school, which also include university students at their leisure time. They spend half of almost their day on the internet, either chatting to friends, taking selfies, and doing those things. Those are the things, part of the things that do slow down growth. Young people in many rural areas in Africa are still struggling to acquire the basic skills in utilizing internet access through trial and error, thereby leading them to the misuse of technology. For example, having a materialistic outlook and a quest to belong to the cream of the society. Wanting to get latest, gadgets, moving from the latest Samsung to the latest device, all over the place. Some of them spend, so much effort in wanting to, get this device rather than consider what they can do with technology and what they can use it for in the area of development. Recommendations. The sense of hopelessness caused by unemployment has fueled the unproductive use of social media by some people. Some African youth rather spend more money to buy data just for social interactions rather than use the data to access training that will be beneficial to them. The role of the government and other institutions, stakeholders, and policymakers it's to find solutions to the misuse of technology. And that's where the public and private partnership have to work together. Also, the role of the youth advocacy in Africa cannot be overemphasized. But then the question is that will the government support the NGOs to move this forward? Significant and sustainable progress towards economic transformation of Africa is not possible without tapping into the potentials of young people. Young people see technology as an aspect of their life, even though many do not have the skill to utilize its development. African countries need to make technology and innovation a priority. In previous years, and even in recent years, technology was allocated limited funding. And this makes, it affects the continent. Africa, lags behind, developed worlds in the area of technology. There are government buildings in Africa that do not have computers or access to the internet. This suggests that some state governments in Africa do not consider development of technology as an option, but they focus more on allocating funding to other infrastructure. Educational technology awareness in Africa. The concept of educational technology favors the promotion, development, and use of information and communication technologies, ICT, media, and other aspects of education in Africa. By implementing this across various African states, African youth will be introduced to a system that makes them embrace modern means of using technology to provide solutions and reduce misuse. To achieve this, ICT has to be available in state schools because exposure to ICT would enhance students' knowledge and understanding in various subjects. Most schools in the rural areas in Africa do not have computer systems or IT systems for distribution of information. If they don't have ICT systems, how can they do research? If they have libraries that are full of old books, how can they access, updated information? Researching the best strategies to install a system that supports technology advancement is a key step to introducing technology mentality among the African youth. Policies regarding the technology are central to its advancement. The policies currently available are long overdue in Africa, and little has been done in policy amendment to accommodate technological dynamic and needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. That was fascinating. And it's a topic that all of us can relate to, but I think you took it from the mere existence of technology to the need to have youth advocacy, to promote it, to avoid misuse. And I also like the fact that you brought it down to recommendations, which are quite broad-based.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.